stand here on this exact patch of earth, and for 1,000 years you would have felt invincible. Marble stretching farther than your eyes could measure. 1,000,000 people breathing in one city, back when most of the world had never seen 10,000 in one place. Aqueducts crossing valleys like veins of a living god. Legions marching home with the wealth of continents strapped to their backs. But on one single day, none of them knew what we know. They didn't know they were living in the final golden afternoon of the greatest power the world had ever built. They ate. They argued in the markets. They placed bets at the races. They had no idea the ground beneath the empire had already begun, quietly, to crack. This is that day. Rome did not fall in an instant. There was no single morning where the sun rose on an empire and set on ruins. It unraveled slowly, the way a rope frays thread by thread, until the last strand simply gives out. But every unraveling has a moment just before the first thread snaps, a moment when everything still looks whole. We're going to walk through that moment. Not the sack of Rome, not the barbarians at the gates, not the final emperor stripped of his throne. Before all of that, one ordinary day inside a city that still believed it was eternal. Because to understand how the mightiest civilization on Earth collapsed, you first have to see exactly what it looked like the day before anyone realized it was dying. The sky over Rome turns the color of heated bronze just before sunrise, and the city stirs the way it has for centuries, not gently, but all at once. Smoke rises from 100,000 hearths packed into insulae, the towering brick apartment blocks that lean over narrow streets, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. Somewhere above the rooftops, gulls wheel over the Tiber, and the river itself moves thick and brown, crowded with barges hauling grain from Egypt, oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul. Rome eats like an empire because it is one. On a normal day, ships from across 3 continents converge on the port of Ostia and are dragged upriver to feed a city that produces almost none of its own food. This single fact, that Rome cannot feed itself, will matter more than anyone standing here today could possibly imagine. But right now, nobody is thinking about supply lines. They're thinking about breakfast. Bakers pull round loaves stamped with their own seal from stone ovens. Steam rises off pots of spiced wine sold to laborers heading toward the docks. Slaves balance baskets of fish still slick from the Tiber, weaving between senators' litters, carried by bearers in matching tunics, the wealthy hidden behind curtains, so they need not look at the poor. Every level of Roman society is already awake, and every level is already unequal. Patricians in silk-trimmed togas, freedmen hustling for contracts, and slaves who make up nearly 1/3 of the population, invisible in official counts, but essential to every single transaction happening in this street. This is the machinery of empire, grinding forward exactly as it has for generations, which is precisely the problem. Walk toward the Forum, and the illusion becomes undeniable. Marble columns rise 60 feet into the morning haze. Temples to gods who have protected Rome for 1,000 years catch the first sunlight on gilded roofs. The Colosseum looms in the near distance, capable of seating 50,000 people for a single afternoon of spectacle, a building so audacious that even now, 2,000 years later, engineers study how it was built. Officials cross the Forum reciting law codes that will influence legal systems on every continent for the next 2 millennia. Merchants strike deals in a currency accepted from Britain to the Persian frontier. This is a civilization that built roads so precise, some remain in use today. Aqueducts so exact, they carried water downhill across 40 miles with barely a margin of error. Everything here whispers the same message. This will last forever. But underneath the marble, something else is happening. The Empire's border legions, once the most feared fighting force on Earth, increasingly aren't Roman at all. Decades of strain have forced the state to recruit mercenaries and allied tribes to guard frontiers that stretch across 3 continents, frontiers too vast for the old system to hold. The treasury, meanwhile, has quietly rotted from the inside. Coins that once glinted with real silver have been diluted for generations, stretched thin to pay for wars, palaces, grain doles, and games. A slow devaluation almost invisible to the people spending them in the market this very morning. And out beyond the horizon, tribes the Romans call barbarians are not the disorganized raiders of old. They are consolidating, adapting Roman tactics, growing into confederations large enough to challenge the legions directly. None of this is visible from where you're standing in the Forum. From here, Rome looks eternal. That is exactly how empires die, not with the city noticing, but with the city convinced it cannot. By midday, the roar from the Colosseum can be heard blocks away, a sound like distant thunder that never quite stops rolling. Inside, 50,000 voices rise together as gladiators circle each other on blood-darkened sand. Some fight for glory. Some fight because they were born slaves and have no other path to freedom. Emperors have learned something crucial about ruling a city this size. A population fed, entertained, and distracted rarely asks hard questions about who's really in charge. Bread and circuses. It's not just a phrase, it's policy. Free grain rations keep hundreds of thousands from starving and from rioting. Spectacle after spectacle keeps the crowd's attention locked on the arena rather than on the treasury, the border, or the increasingly hollow chain of command running all the way up to the emperor's throne. But maintaining an empire's worth of games and grain costs more every single year, and the money to pay for it has to come from somewhere. Taxes climb on provinces already stretched thin. Farmland gets abandoned as small landowners, crushed by debt, sell to wealthy senators building sprawling private estates. The middle of Roman society, the very foundation that once supplied its soldiers and craftsmen, is quietly eroding. Nobody watching the games this afternoon can feel any of that. They can only feel the heat of the crowd, the dust kicked up from the arena floor, the electric silence before a killing blow. It is, by every visible measure, a magnificent day to be Roman. And that's the part almost nobody tells you about the fall of Rome. It wasn't a single battle. It wasn't one bad emperor or one lost war. It was 1,000 ordinary days exactly like this one, each looking almost identical to the last, while underneath the surface, the empire quietly spent down everything that had made it great. Fires, invasions, currency collapse, a hollowed-out army, a capital more interested in spectacle than in the slow bleeding at its edges. And yet, somehow, this civilization's roads, its laws, its language, and its architecture would go on to shape the entire world for 2,000 years after the marble finally cracked. Rome fell. But in every court of law, every arch, every aqueduct still standing, in every language descended from Latin still spoken today, it never really disappeared at all. If this journey through Rome's final golden hour pulled you in, subscribe to the hidden empire. We rebuild the lost world, one civilization at a time. And tell us in the comments, which empire, city, or vanished world should we walk through next?